Hi, I'm Jeff Sickinga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea.
Hello, everyone. This is John Moser with another edition of The American Idea. I'm very pleased to be speaking today on the subject of the atomic bomb with Richard B. Frank. Richard Frank is, after he graduated from the University of Missouri in 1969, he went to Vietnam, where he served as a platoon leader in the 101st Airborne. Quite an impressive feat in and of itself. He's better known today as an authority on World War II in Asia and the Pacific. His first book in 1990 was A History of the Guadalcanal Campaign. He really came to national attention, I think, with his second work, Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, which was published in 1999. It has been heralded as one of the 6 best books in English about World War II, and that's an assessment that I can't disagree with, having read it myself. He followed that up in March 2020 with the first volume of what will be a trilogy on the Asia-Pacific War. That first volume is called Tower of Skulls, and I have not gotten a hold of that yet, but I certainly intend to. Richard Frank, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for having me.
So the atomic bomb and the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 has, in recent years, been a matter of controversy. Was the use of the atomic bombs controversial at the time?
That's a very interesting point. What's very difficult for Americans who have been born in the last 50 years or so to understand is that for the first 20 years or so after the bombs were dropped, there was no real controversy in this country. It was generally accepted the bombs use was justified. It ended the war, saved an enormous number of casualties, both in Japan and the U.S. This all changed in the mid-1960s when that basic narrative was being challenged. Those challenges between the new narrative and the old narrative clashed most spectacularly at the Enola Gay controversy in 1995. And for purposes of what we're doing today, the important thing to remember now is that from 1995 and since then, we've gained a vast amount of additional information, both on the U.S. side and on the Japanese side, which reframes much of these events on both sides. And that's really what I'm working from now. I'm not going back to use some of the older incomplete evidence that was available for the first, basically about 40 years after the war.
What's the source of the controversy, if we could cover that very briefly?
Well, the way I see the controversy, there's really 2 basic levels of it. One is sort of a moral issue about the horror of the bombs just by themselves. And the second basic area of controversy is sort of factual, what exactly happened and why on both sides. On the moral issue, which I think really is the most important one, certainly for today, I think the very essential issue you need to understand is that to judge the moral issue, the 2 things you have to do is to count all the dead and treat all the dead as sharing a common humanity. And this gets back to a very fundamental point about the war at that time. And that point is that the number of Japanese civilians who died in what we call the Second World War is a very tiny fraction of the number of civilians, overwhelmingly other Asians, predominantly Chinese, who died all over Japan's empire from Japan's actions. And the ratio is somewhere in the vicinity of, for every single Japanese civilian death, there are something close to 18 other deaths, about 2/3 Chinese, the rest Asians throughout the rest of the territories that Japan conquered. Once you understand those basic numbers, you understand that what was happening in 1945 in August was not a question in which only the lives of Japanese civilians in 2 cities were threatened. It involved an enormous number of other civilians throughout Asia whose lives had been imperiled, had been sacrificed, and continue to be imperiled at that time.
So to the extent that the use of the atomic bombs shortened the war, they can be said to have saved lives. Now, we immediately think, well, it saves the lives of U.S. soldiers who might have had to invade, but it saved the lives of civilians on the continent of Asia.
That's correct. And clearly, from the American political standpoint, particularly Mr. Truman's standpoint, I mean, his first obligation was to the American people, and their immediate focus was on the lives of their sons and daughters who were potentially going to die in the final stages of war with Japan, wherever that happened to go, including particularly an invasion. If you've dealt, as I have, with scholars in other Asian nations, you'll clearly understand that they view this as a deliverance that stopped what was a horrendous level of death and suffering that was in progress and had been in progress for quite some time. The way I figure it, using pretty standard academic sources, China lost about 12 million civilians during the war. That's based on the work of Dr. Ronald Miller, and that's the very lowest end estimate that he has. 12 million over 8 years, over 2,963 days, is literally 4,000 Chinese every single day the war went on. If you look at the number of deaths that occurred from December 1941, when Japan expanded the war going through South and Southeast Asia, you add somewhere between about 5.8 and another 6 million dead over 1,346 days, which is over 4,000 a day. So basically, between December 41 and August 45, there are 8,000 Asians, overwhelmingly, who are not Japanese, who are dying every single day the war goes on, 240,000 per month. If you do the math on this, you find that that translates into about 51 Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's in that period from December 41 to August 1945. If you don't understand that basic point, you cannot begin to grapple with the moral issues of the end of the war and the use of atomic bombs.
That is a fascinating point. So maybe then we need to turn things around and look at things from the perspective of the Japanese government and the more or less military regime that existed. We know the surrender came in August of 1945, but surely there was an understanding in the upper ranks in Tokyo well before that the war was lost, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. In fact, we can pinpoint that there was a secret war diary at Imperial General Headquarters, which was it was the equivalent of the Pentagon in Japan. And in July 1944, that diary admitted that the war was effectively lost. Well, but there's a big difference between the war being lost and an actual surrender. The problem from the Japanese standpoint was that no Japanese government had ever surrendered to a foreign power in the history of Japan, which by Japanese count was 2,600 years, and no Japanese unit had ever surrendered in the Asia-Pacific War. And there was this tradition, this conviction, this warrior culture, which absolutely rebelled at the very idea of surrender. Now, coupled to that was a very shrewd strategic assessment. And this came in January 1945, where the Japanese recognized that the war situation was horrible and was only going to get worse if it continued in the current trajectory. So what they did was they assessed the situation as follows. That those impatient Americans would not be content to sit back and blockade and bombard Japan, which they had no alternative. They believed that if they could meet and either defeat or inflict huge casualties on the initial American invasion of Japan, they could break the will of the American people to continue the war to unconditional surrender. And they had a complete misperception of how many casualties they'd already inflicted on the U.S. at that time, but they adopted what they called this strategy called Ketsugo. It had a military and a diplomatic component, but they were sequential, not parallel. The key point was they did not believe they could get an acceptable peace from their standpoint unless they changed the military realities. And that was what they were going to do by meeting that initial invasion and defeating it or inflicting huge casualties. Then and only then would they go on to a diplomatic phase. And they correctly assessed that we were going to target southern Kyushu. This was simply a matter of knowing our operational technique of always making a landing within range of land-based air power, calculating that the land-based air power that was critical was on Okinawa, taking their dividers and calculating the range of American fighter planes to the homeland of Japan, which gave them southern Kyushu, looking for the fact that the U.S. would come to get air base sites and also naval support sites on Kyushu. And they looked at where the level terrain was, where air base sites existed or could be created. You look at a topographical map of Kyushu, that tells you exactly where a landing is going to be made. And they began a massive buildup on Kyushu. And we did not detect this until later, which is another part of the story. But basically, the military was quite confident that they had a winning combination to bring the war to a negotiated peace they could accept.
When you say we didn't know this until later, we being the United States, at what point did we learn what kind of buildup there was?
Well, that's a critical part of the story, and it's one when I mentioned that the evidence since 1995 is critical. This is where this was released. We didn't release code-breaking radio intelligence material until starting in the mid-1990s. It continued for quite some time. It's an enormous body of evidence, but the most essential thing in that body of evidence was there were two main streams. The first of which was about military developments concerning Japan, and the second was diplomatic elements. And now these were presented to top American policymakers, starting with President Truman, in a daily summary. One was called the Far Eastern Summary, which was about the military end, and one was about the diplomatic end of it. And what these showed was, first of all, on the diplomatic end, anyone reading the exchanges by the Japanese, particularly to the foreign minister and the exchanges with the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, who was the main conduit for such diplomatic efforts that were being made. And these showed that they were completely unrealistic, as that very ambassador said to Japan, that, you think the Soviets are going to aid us. They have no intention to do so. If we're going to secure their help, we need to provide inducements. And the inducements he described coming from Japan in that respect were, pretty little words devoid of connection to reality. And then he kept coming back to, if you really want to end the war, you have to come up with a set of terms. He came back to that repeatedly. He could never get them. Meanwhile, beginning in July, particularly, we developed intelligence indicating this enormous Japanese buildup on the ground in Kyushu, and a tremendous buildup of aircraft, particularly kamikazes. Essentially, when we were originally planning to go to southern Kyushu, we thought the Japanese were only going to have 3 divisions. By the end of July, going into August, right when the decision was being made about using the bomb, we knew that there was a stupendously larger garrison. The numbers were ranging up beyond 600,000. The actual number was somewhere between 700,000 and 900,000. We were identifying new units almost every day during that period, showing a nightmare scenario that we'd be facing a situation, as one intelligence officer put it, we'll be going in at the ratio of 1 to 1, and this is not a recipe for victory. So that intelligence information is perhaps the most important evidence that supported Mr. Truman's decision, but he and his government forfeited that evidence by preserving the security of the radio intelligence material. And had we had that from the beginning, this controversy, in my view, would never have gotten to the extent it has reached.
This is really important. I recall reading the minutes of a meeting, was it in May or June, involving General Marshall, Admiral Leahy, the president, Truman himself was there, and they're putting forward estimates. And the estimate was, well, we could expect to lose. We're going in with a force of 750,000. We could probably expect a similar level of casualties to what we suffered in Okinawa, which was about 1/3. And this was on the basis of what they thought the Japanese defense was going to be at the time. But by the end of July, of course, those estimates of casualties would have to be estimated considerably upward.
This whole issue of the casualties has become a very tangled scheme. The critical issue to me is that there was no system for estimating casualties in 1945 that was reliable. General Marshall himself called all of that speculation. If you go down into the deep depths of the records or whatever, you find that, in fact, most people who addressed the issue of casualties at the top political and military level, they didn't use ground numbers. They searched for analogies to some prior campaign. And that was predominantly what was presented to Truman at that meeting, which was on the 18th of June, 1945. Even so, and I go through this in Downfall in some detail about several sets of ways of calculating casualties came before Truman, including the one of Admiral Leahy suggesting it's going to be about like Okinawa, which was not a very attractive. I mean, that's talking over 200,000 casualties based on what they thought they were getting at that time. So by late July into August, basically no one was trying to do revised casualty estimates. They were looking at this horrifying buildup and realizing that whatever we thought before was totally invalid to what we were looking at now. And one of the things that's telling about this is that General Marshall thought the situation was looking so dire that he actually sent a message to General MacArthur, who was going to command the invasion, on the 7th of August, 1945, which asked MacArthur, based on the intelligence about the buildup, do you still think the invasion is viable? And MacArthur said he didn't really believe the intelligence, and let's go ahead and do it. Well, Admiral King, Ernest King, the chief naval officer, who was adamantly opposed that there would never be an invasion of Japan on his watch, had been waiting for the moment to basically bring on this huge collision between the Army and the Navy over the invasion strategy itself. And he had set this up by some actions he'd taken earlier in the year. And now when he saw that exchange between Marshall and MacArthur, he sent a message to the senior naval officer in the Pacific, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, and asked Nimitz to comment on that exchange. Well, I like to say that you never play cards with a sailor because they always have something up their sleeve. And what King knew, because there had been a back channel exchange between he and Nimitz that no one in the Army had seen, in which Nimitz had announced in May that after 2 months of Okinawa, he could no longer support any invasion of the Japanese home islands. So King knew that by sending that message, he was going to trigger this big showdown battle between the Army and the Navy over whether an invasion was viable. The other thing that Marshall did was he sent one of his staff officers to someone at the Manhattan Project, which was building the bombs, and asked them how many bombs they were going to have by the 1st of November, which was the scheduled date for the invasion. And the staff officer said that General Marshall believed that 2 bombs on Japanese cities would either force a surrender, or no further bombs on cities would do anything, that he wanted to preserve the supply of atomic weapons to support what we now call tactical use, to bolster the argument that we'd still go to Kyushu, because he knew it was a losing argument based on the intelligence. So that's an entirely dramatic part of the story that just totally gets left out.
Wow. Yeah. I want to go back to the Japanese side of things for a moment. What role did the emperor play in these discussions that were going on? Can we win the war? How do we get out of it honorably, et cetera?
Well, the whole role of Emperor Hirohito it's a whole separate controversy in itself. Basically, it goes to what I would describe as the basic dysfunction of the Japanese political and military decision-making process. In fact, I would argue that of all the major combatants in World War II, the Japanese were the leaders in dysfunction in terms of decision-making at the top level. The most fundamental reason for that goes back to the Meiji Constitution, which was modeled on the German, Wilhelmian German Constitution, which made the armed forces independent of subordination to the legal government. The armed forces ostensibly only answered to the emperor. They were not only constitutionally independent, but they gained the right over the years, first the Imperial Army and then the Imperial Navy, to appoint the key Army and Navy ministers in each cabinet. And if they did not want the cabinet formed, they could refuse to appoint those officers and collapse that proposal for a cabinet. Or if there was a cabinet existing whose policies they disagreed with, they could have the Army or Navy minister resign, and that would collapse the cabinet. So they had an absolute veto over anything the government was going to do. So it gets back to, what did the emperor see his role as? And from the time he became emperor in late 1925 until August of 1945, Emperor Hirohito chose the path of presiding, not deciding. He was held up to be divine, the supreme leader, infallible, and the Japanese had installed this cutoff between the emperor and governmental policies to preserve his infallibility. And what he did routinely was he accepted what was presented to him by his civilian or military leaders as their proposed policies, and he sanctioned it. He frequently asked a lot of questions, good questions, and he was very well briefed, but he did not directly intervene to order any action by the government for 20 years, except on one occasion in February 1936, when there was a coup literally under his nose in Tokyo that involved assassination of members of his immediate household. And then and only then he put on his field marshal's uniform and went down and told the armed force commanders, you will suppress this rebellion. Up until August 1945, that was the only time the emperor had ever intervened. And he was standing there watching what was going on, becoming more and more alarmed as 1945 went on, but he had not intervened. And whether he would intervene was a big question, because he was not entirely confident that even if he intervened, the armed forces would obey his order.
So he couldn't, I mean, it was believed that he could not afford to identify himself personally with any major decision for fear that the decision would go wrong. That's what you're saying?
That's essentially how the government was set up in Japan, to insulate the emperor from responsibility that could, basically, undermine his aura of infallibility. And this enormous aura that surrounded the emperor is not only a political leader, but as a religious leader, as the head of the Japanese people. A descendant from the gods, and all the Japanese people were his subjects and his descendants also. So this belief of the Japanese people of having this special divine sanction.
Let's talk about alternatives to the atomic bomb. We've already discussed the blockade option and why it seemed by late July to be increasingly unworkable. What other possibilities were there aside from the bomb, I should say?
There really were what I call an unstable compromise between the American armed forces, the Army and the Navy, over how to end the war with Japan. And they really, interestingly, divided really over more of a political question than what you'd regard as a strictly military question. The Army believed the critical issue was time, that the American people could not countenance a war that would go on for a very long time. And they believed that the swiftest way to end the war was by invading the Japanese homeland. Mm-hmm. The Navy had an incredibly proprietary attitude towards war with Japan. They'd studied it since 1906, particularly between World War I and World War II. And part of that study examined the prospect of invading the Japanese homeland. And the Navy concluded that we'd never be able to project an expeditionary force across the Pacific that would outnumber the Japanese and the home islands, and that the terrain of Japan, everything that was not steep, was soaked, would negate our advantages in firepower and mobility, and that any invasion of Japan would produce politically unacceptable casualties. And this was, as one wag once offered, that this was genetically encoded in 2 generations of U.S. naval officers, that you never, ever, ever invade the Japanese homeland. Well, those 2 views clashed in the first part of 1945, and what came out was a compromise. The Navy, led by Admiral King, as I mentioned, agreed to issuing an order for that initial invasion of Japan. But when that order was issued in, well, it was April and May, there were a couple of steps in this, King wrote a memo to the other members of the Joint Chiefs and said, look, I'm only agreeing that we issue an order now. We will come back to visit the issue of whether we're actually going to invade Japan in August or September. And he wasn't thinking about atomic bombs. He was thinking about when the Navy would close in and clamp down a really close blockade against Japan, and the Army Air Force program of bombing would reach a crescendo. From the Navy standpoint, based on the British and German experience of World War I, they viewed a blockade as being legitimate now, as it had not been in hundreds of years, to actually cut off the supply of food to a nation. So their real aim in this was to threaten to kill millions of Japanese by starvation with the blockade. One of the problems in the history, you'll see people citing admirals saying, well, we could have ended the war by an alternate means. They don't tell you that the alternate means were to basically kill millions of Japanese, mostly non-combatants, from starvation.
Yeah. I had also read that there was a suggestion that perhaps the atomic bomb could be demonstrated on a remote island just to show its power, and then implicitly saying, "This is your last chance. We're going to start using these on your cities if you don't surrender now." Why was that not explored further anyway?
It was explored, but it was rejected, including by the leading scientists, including Oppenheimer. Now, this really ties into very closely into what was the actual Japanese reaction to the two atomic bombs. And the secret to understanding this is to understand that the Japanese had their own atomic bomb program. It did not produce a bomb, but what it did produce was a very fundamental knowledge that producing the bomb involves creating fissionable material, and fissionable material is extremely expensive in time, money, and resources to create, and you're not going to produce that much of it. So the Japanese understood that someone might be able to create an atomic bomb, but could they create an arsenal of such weapons? On the U.S. side, from very early on, one of the advisors in the program, an admiral named William Purnell, said that to get the Japanese to surrender with atomic weapons, he will take two bombs. The first bomb establishes that we have an atomic bomb. The second bomb implies that we have an arsenal of atomic bombs. So under any demonstration scenario, the Japanese, and I'll come to a moment about how they reacted to the real bomb, would have said, "Very interesting, let's see you do 4 in a row." It was a non-starter with respect to Barton Bernstein, a historian I much respect. He entirely agrees that if you really understand what the Japanese understood about atomic weapons in 1945, there's no way a demonstration would have worked. Now, when the Japanese got word of the Hiroshima bomb and Truman announced it was an atomic bomb, one of the things I was really startled by when I was examining this was the reaction of the Japanese armed forces was immediate. The Imperial Army reacted, "Well, we won't concede it's an atomic bomb until investigation." The Imperial Navy said, "Well, maybe they have one atomic bomb, but they can't have that many of them. They can't be that powerful, or maybe they'll be dissuaded by international pressure from using them." So this gets back to the basic issue of the first bomb did not immediately impact the Japanese military decision makers, because this whole issue of whether they thought we really had more than one bomb, in fact, whether they thought we had even one bomb. The second bomb at Nagasaki, however, that totally changed the perception of what was going on. And after that bomb was dropped, suddenly there was the specter that we had an arsenal of atomic bombs. And the key point here is that if we had an arsenal of atomic bombs, does that mean that the U.S. will not come and invade? If we didn't come and invade, the Japanese military had no realistic strategy except for the nation to die. And after the second bomb, the army minister, a general named Anami, who was the second most powerful man in Japan next to the emperor, he had been rejecting the notion that first bomb was important. And now he's running around telling other policymakers, well, the Americans may have 50 atomic bombs and the next target is Tokyo. Now, that's a hell of an argument for continuing the war to convince your other decision leaders as to what to do. So, in fact, the Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki in December 1945, he basically tracked this whole thing. He said, we were going along with Ketsugo, whatever here, until you dropped the bombs and suddenly realized you might not invade. And then it was time to surrender.
Before we continue with our discussion, I'd like to let you know about an outstanding set of programs that Ashbrook sponsors for high school students, the Ashbrook Academy.
Do you know any students with an interest in American history, politics, economics, and literature? Do they enjoy being academically challenged and the thrill of engaging with different ideas and viewpoints? Hi, I'm Sabrina Maristella, Student Programs Coordinator here at the Ashbrook Center. The Ashbrook Academy is a series of summer courses for rising high school juniors and seniors. Held in person at Ashland University, the Academy immerses you in the American story like you've never been before. Since 2015, our approach has taken history out of textbooks and into students' lives with historical documents and conversations about those documents. If you are a rising high school junior or senior, or if you know someone who is, we invite you to learn more about our courses and apply today at ashbrookacademy.org.
So let's talk about a bit of a counterfactual. We know that one of the sticking points on the Japanese side was fear that if they lost the war, they would lose the kokutai, right? The imperial system that had prevailed for thousands of years. We know that ultimately the United States allowed that. Had it been made clear to the leadership in Tokyo in July of 1945 that we will accept your surrender and we will guarantee that you could keep your emperor, might that have caused would that have been enough to get the Japanese to surrender without the use of the atomic bombs or an invasion or anything else like that?
That's a very, very good question. The answer is somewhat complex. Americans recognize, at least some of the Americans, particularly Secretary of War Henry Stimson and a senior diplomat, Joseph Grew, thought that that whole issue of the Japanese being assured about the maintenance of their imperial system or even retention of the emperor was essential to get the Japanese surrender. The problem within American ranks was the way it was viewed was that Japan had launched this horrendous war of aggression across Asia, Southeast Asia, killed millions and millions of people. And the three pillars behind that effort had been militarism, the Shinto religion, and the emperor system. And so from the standpoint of the people who, from our perspective today, we call them the liberals, they thought it was an anathema to guarantee the emperor's position and probably the imperial institution. Now, what actually happened was that we had been going through the whole issue of what unconditional surrender would mean. And in the summer of 1945, we reached the point where one of the alternatives that actually was, in effect, examined was, could we use diplomacy to end the war without further military action, including the invasion? And this led to the drafting of what was called the Potsdam Declaration, which was issued on the 26th of July, 1946. Now, the impetus behind this was very much American domestic political opinion, which was anxious to end the war as swiftly as possible with at least American loss. The difference between the Potsdam Declaration and what happened to Germany is illuminating. Unconditional surrender in Germany meant a blank check. The Germans got no guarantee of any term whatsoever in their surrender. It was unconditional surrender with no terms whatsoever. What the Potsdam Declaration did was provide what you might call a second version of unconditional surrender, which is to say, here are the terms, there will be no negotiation. And they set out a series of guarantees, like, for instance, the Japanese people would not be held individually accountable. It would be the leadership that would be held accountable. They would be free to return home and go about their business. We also expressly addressed the issue of what form of government the Japanese would have. And after several permutations were gone through, we reverted back to basically the standard that was used in the Atlantic Charter, which was that after a period of occupation, where we guaranteed the Japanese would be democratic and demilitarized, then the Japanese people themselves would be free to choose their own form of government. And that statement did not include any provision that they would not be able to maintain an imperial institution, that they would not be able to maintain the emperor. Some of the Japanese picked up immediately on the fact that effectively that's what was being guaranteed. And the big kicker in all of this was discovered by a historian at the University of Washington State, Mariko Kawamura. When the Japanese go through these permutations between the 10th and the 14th of August about whether to surrender or not, the emperor had intervened, and he originally they sent a message to the U.S. saying, we're going to accept the Potsdam Declaration, except that it will not compromise the prerogatives of the emperor as sovereign ruler, which actually meant, in reality, that the emperor would be supreme over the occupation commander. And we sent a note back saying that no, the emperor and the government would be subordinate to the occupation commander. There was resistance to accepting that. The emperor, in his discussions with his principal aide, a fellow named Quito, on the 13th of August, at that point says he now believes that no matter what the Americans wish, even if the Americans wish to continue the imperial institution, if the Japanese people don't support it, it will not continue. And therefore, I am prepared to submit the fate of the imperial institution, and in effect his fate, to the vote, the views of the Japanese people. Now, what is startling about that was this is the Potsdam Declaration term. The Japanese people will be free to choose their own form of government. And the emperor on the 13th of August is realizing that that's what's acceptable to him. So that
makes sense.
That's part of that story.
Yeah. So we get up to 9 August 1945. On that day, the second atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. On that same day, the Soviet army invades Manchuria in honoring its pledges from Yalta. That muddies the issue of what ultimately caused the surrender, does it not? I know there are some historians who have claimed that the Soviet intervention was more responsible. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're exactly right. And basically, the controversy that has existed from the mid-1960s up until relatively recently presented the options for explaining the Japanese surrender as either between the atomic bombs or Soviet intervention, and the idea that Soviet intervention alone was enough to cause the Japanese surrender, of course, implied that the atomic bombs had not been necessary, and therefore, they were questionable, both practically and morally. When I wrote Downfall, I was plowing through the evidence we had. And one of the things that's ironic about the Japanese side of the story is that after the Japanese announced they were surrendering, they had a number of days before the occupation began, and they engaged in wholesale destruction of records, or they took records and hid them and then claimed they'd been destroyed. So we didn't know for a long time. And in fact, the record on the Japanese side was never complete, except in one respect. And that was the diplomatic intercepts, because the Japanese had no idea those were being intercepted and read. And those are key to understanding what the Japanese were really thinking or whatever here at that time. What I also found was that there was a third factor involved. This was referred to many times by various Japanese figures, and I can give you a list in Downfall of the number of times that this was mentioned. It went under the euphemism of the domestic situation. And this was the idea that the leadership, especially up to and including the emperor, had believed, basically because of the trajectory of the war to that point, the bombing, the blockade, the food shortages, which were going to get much worse towards the end of the year with the fall rice crop. We did not look promising and was in fact going to be a disaster. And they were fearful that this was going to lead to a domestic upheaval, a revolution that would topple not only the emperor from the throne, but the whole imperial institution. And this was referred to as the domestic situation. And this is the third factor. Now, what's interesting and telling about this is that after the Japanese surrender, or the process of doing this, the Navy minister, a fellow named Admiral Yone, tells one of his subordinates that, and this is pretty close to a quote, he says, in a way, the atomic bombs and Soviet intervention are gifts from the gods, because now we don't have to admit the real reason we're surrendering is the domestic situation. So, and Dr. Kawamura, in her analysis in this excellent book, Emperor Hirohito and the Pacific War, she says that was the fundamental reason that Japan really surrendered. It was, quote, the domestic situation. That's what convinced the emperor more than anything else that the war should end. Now, I would add that said, you still had the problem of getting the armed forces to comply, right? And that's why I think the atomic bombs, even under that scenario, are indispensable, because they basically show the Japanese armed forces that we won't come and invade. They have no viable strategy. It also is an impetus to the emperor's decision, because we know now, and I had been skeptical about this initially, we know now that the emperor met with the foreign minister on the afternoon of August 8th. That's 2 days after Hiroshima, before Soviet intervention on Nagasaki, and said the war has to end now. And we've had one of the pieces of evidence we received now since the emperor died is confirmation that that took place, and that was the gist of that conversation. So he'd already decided to end the war. But once again, you have to understand that from where he's coming from, he's not 100% sure that even his order will get Japan to surrender.
I'm going to go back to this about your point about the domestic situation. We don't normally think of Imperial Japan as a place that worried too much about the opinion of the emperor's subjects, but in a way, this makes sense. The amount of attention that was paid to broadcast propaganda, to posters exhorting people all the time to do their duty, suggests that this was a regime that was extremely sensitive to what was going on at the public level. Is that correct?
Yes. As a matter of fact, a key part of the evidence on this is that the Kemputai, the secret police, and some other police were monitoring public opinion. And they were picking up these signs like graffiti and all kinds of other things. Now, to be honest, I think that what they were picking up then was sort of the preliminary low-level manifestation of this or whatever here. And what the Japanese leadership was looking at was not what the situation was in July, but what it was likely to be by October, November. That's when they perceived that the real crisis would be hit. So, it is something that initially none of us would have thought that this regime, which seemed to be so thoroughly established, would have any fear about what the domestic population thought. Well, it turns out we have a lot of evidence from a lot of sources, including this point about the emperor himself saying, if the Japanese people don't agree to keep the institution and me, then, it'll go away. So let's get their view on this or whatever here.
Let me raise another point that some historians have made, that Truman's final decision to drop the bomb was perhaps motivated less by the need to bring Japan to its knees, and perhaps more as a means of impressing the Soviet Union, as there were already signs of problems in the relationship between the United States and the USSR, ones that would obviously harden into the Cold War not long afterward. What do you think of that view?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and it's been a controversial point, and it's sort of a matter of a holy writ in some people's view that Truman was really motivated by intimidating the Soviets. I think the best formulation of what really was going on in Truman's mind was by Dr. Barton Bernstein of Stanford, he was a mentor to me and an invaluable source of insight on just about anything you can imagine. And what Bart said was that acknowledged that what's clear now, clearly we realized that there were serious problems in dealing with the Soviets. Most of these emanated from what was going on in Europe in the first part of 1945, as the war ended and the Soviets overran Eastern and Central Europe, and particularly over Poland or whatever here. So the issue of a contentious relationship with the Soviet Union was clearly manifest. It was clearly on the minds of American leaders. But as Bart put it, that may have been on their mind, but basically the use of the atomic bomb, to the degree it would have provided any leverage against the Soviet Union, that was simply a bonus. But the real reason was to end the war without further American casualties or loss in 1945. The fact that it would have also some possible impact on the Soviets, and what impact it really had is another question, was not a material factor moving it. In fact, if the Soviet Union had not existed, the bombs still would have been dropped, because the whole basic issue was ending the war with Japan. And as I mentioned, by late July, 1st of August, 1945, the invasion strategy looked like it was going to be a bloodbath, probably unsupportable bloodbath. What do you do at that point? Use every weapon in your arsenal. And the further point that's been made is that, had the war gone on and supposedly gone on to an invasion or some other thing. The notion that we had at our hands weapons that could have ended the war earlier with fewer American losses would have been politically dynamite in the U.S. It would have been completely unacceptable to the American people to believe that we could have ended the war without further American loss, and we didn't use it.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time together. I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to add about this fascinating subject.
Well, I don't at all dispute the fact that we should contemplate this, and we should discuss this or even argue about it or whatever. But I think if you really understand, first of all, the moral framework of this, that this was not simply an issue about the life or death of Japanese civilians in two cities. This was about the death and the enormous death toll of civilians throughout Japan's empire that had been ongoing and were continuing literally on a daily basis in August 1945. If you understand that moral framework, I think you'll have a sober way to approach the whole number of factual issues about this. I think it's also an object lesson in just exactly how Mr. Truman and his administration, those individuals had to make decisions. All of the rest of us can be mighty thankful that we were never confronted with ourselves.
Richard Frank, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.